So welcome everyone to the food coma. So sketching, right? I'm going to talk about two parts. So fundamentals and applications. Chenxi is going to talk about applications. So sketching is a kind of fun, weird representation of geometry, if you think about it this way. We have all the point clouds, meshes, and everything. But sketching is a natural way of representing geometry. Like in your life, you probably have drawn at least a single drawing. And it takes roughly 20 seconds for this person to draw a pretty complicated pose, right? Which is pretty impressive if you think about it. At the same time, as a geometry representation, if you want to do something with it, with this drawing, it turns out to be a pretty complicated thing. Lots of strokes, lots of problems, lots of inaccuracies, lots of distortions. So first of all, let's think for a second what we can do with those sketches. So Chenxi is going to present some of the potential applications, and then I'm going to talk about how to actually do this. All right, Chenxi.
Thanks for the opening. Hi, my name is Chenxi. I'm going to cover problem setups and real-world applications to motivate our discussions. I'm going to talk about actual papers later in this course, okay? So to give you a view of sketch-related research and applications, we roughly follow the creation procedures. So on the very low level, we have samples captured by drawing devices or pixels stored as raster images. So in the middle, we'll look at how they can make up 2D and 3D sketches. And because these sketches are rough, how they can be further processed and be usable for applications. So on this high level, we have the creation and editing of models and animations. This is not in the creation process, but we'll also cover the vision tasks for sketch data because of increasing interests. Let's start with how the action of sketching is recorded and turned into digital strokes. Okay. Sketching and drawing activities are recorded by digital drawing devices. Starting from the 60s, people have been using external drawing tablets. More recently, drawing on touchable device becomes more reliable and popular among novice and professional artists alike. For 3D drawing, it started around the same time, but it takes longer to take off. These devices are still considered a little bit of novel items nowadays and have not yet become standard practice. So what do we get from these devices? Between a pair of pen down and pen up actions, for 2D, we get sample sequences of 2D positions with timestamp, pressure, and tilt. For 3D, similarly, we have the XYZ, the time, but now we have the orientations. These raw sample sequences need to be turned into digital strokes. We can represent a 2D stroke by as a polyline, as a parametric curve, or a spline. For 3D, we may have tubes, calligraphic curves, sometimes also called ribbons. It is trivial to construct strokes as 2D polylines by simply connecting the dots. But people often want to do better than that, and we'll see later. Another way of getting samples is from raster images. For applications such as auto-in-betweening, like in this example, and also for sketch-based modeling, it's necessary to vectorize these raster inputs. So here we can see on the left, we have the raster raw drawing, and on the right, we have the actual vector drawing for the animation. Okay, so we get these raster sketches from digital drawing or from scanning. They come in different types. We can have clean sketch like this one, or we may have a sketch containing overdrawing and shading like this. Before we talk about actual vectorization, one of the tasks is to clean up rough raster sketches into clean raster line drawings. This method can be directly used in raster drawing software, and also they are good for pre-processing. For the actual sketch vectorization, they turn stroke center lines into vector curves. For example, here we have the polylines. This is very different from photo vectorization, which focuses on regions. When reading sketch vectorization papers, one should pay attention to whether this method takes clean sketches or rough sketches with overdrawing as its inputs. Most methods only work on clean inputs, but can be combined with raster cleanup method we just saw before. Now let's go back to the roadmap. We've gotten to these sketches in vector format. Unfortunately, most rough vector sketches are not directly usable. And this is because they all contain overdrawing, like over here. To get clean line drawings from this, for example, for cartoon production, there's a separate step called cleanup, and is often done by a dedicated team of artists. As shown over here, it is pretty time-consuming, and people need to do this for each frame. Even when we have the clean sketches, there are also inaccurate junctions. The common next step in the cartoon production is the flat colorization, that is to separate regions in a sketch. We can see in this video, inaccurate junctions can also make this step really hard because so we'll see over here, because the bucket fill doesn't always work out of the box. So that's a problem. Our next topic is lifting 2D sketches to 3D. The goal is to determine the depth values of strokes from a single sketch. So this is the correct answer for this example, but this is a challenging and ill-posed problem. We can have many alternative results. The key here is to use some types of priors, and we'll see them later. Okay. Next, we are going to look at how to turn 3D sketches into 3D models. There are 3 types of inputs for this method. We have the point samples. So for them, we don't have the connectivity, and normals are inconsistently oriented. Then we may also have ribbons. We have the connectivity here, but the normals are still inconsistently oriented. There can also be hidden parts within the inside of the model. And we may also have the tubes. So again, we have the connectivity, but normals, and they can be from the lifted 2D sketches. So here are some real data. For the point samples, we can sample the stroke center lines to get those. And we can see there are 2 colors, the green and the purple, indicating different orientations, and they may be inside hidden parts. So for the tubes, we may have inaccurate junctions similar to the 2D scenario. Finally, we are going to talk about using 2D sketches for exciting applications, such as modeling and animation. I believe I don't need to convince you that 2D modeling and animation is hard and time-consuming. That motivates sketch-based approaches for modeling, editing, posing, and animation. Because sketching is intuitive and expressive, it's novice-friendly, and it makes visual communication easier. So last, I'm going to briefly cover sketch-related vision tasks without going into too much details. Now I'm passing the course back to Misha. Thank you.
Thanks, Chenxi. Where's this thing? All right, cool. So now let's think about general processing things. How can we do any processing on sketches, or how can we do all those applications, vectorization, whatever else, right? And one of the first questions that comes into your mind is that sketches are kind of like photographs, kind of close enough. So how about we try a simple task? Here's a sketch of a human, and we would like to reconstruct a 3D pose. In computer vision, this is called monocular pose reconstruction. It's pretty standard, well-developed methods. So how about we take something off the shelf that was state-of-the-art a couple of years ago, and that's what it produces. Yeah. It's kind of sad, actually. And like from the side, it does look like the drawing. Once you turn it a little bit, it's not satisfying. So what's the big deal? Why is it failing so miserably? And we actually kind of fine-tuned the thing so that it actually kind of finds the 2D joints correctly. So it's not failing just because of 2D. Something more is going on. Anyway, so what's so special about sketches? If you take a sample sketch here, there are a bunch of things that are going kind of weird. And if you think about the methods trying to process the sketch, you have to take that into account, so whatever you do with them. So for example, there are some broken strokes. This part was supposed to be a single stroke, but it's drawn with multiple curves, right? Or maybe overdrawn, right? Like this is supposed to be a single stroke, but the artist just added a bunch of stuff, yeah? Some strokes, I have no idea what that is. This is kind of some sort of shoelace. I don't know what it is. So like if you assign some clear meaning to strokes, you'll be in a bit of a trouble, right? Now, if you think about the shape, exact shape that it depicts, it's also very distorted. It's strange. Or proportions. Compare, for example, realistic proportions of an elbow and a hip to this. It's pretty far off, right? And that turns out for humans, it's actually not a big deal. We imagine the pose pretty well, even from this rough drawing, right? And if you think about proportions in some other context, this is a pretty decent doodle. We understand it's a van, right? But the shapes are all over the place, right? And even more subtle, some of the things, like if you compare this drawing was done from this rendering, it's somehow off, but it's kind of hard to put your finger on it, right? So the shape is somehow distorted. And in general, even for pretty decent sketches like this one, nothing is ever precise, right? So everything that's supposed to be a straight line is not a straight line, it's kind of, sorta. And everything is supposed to be elliptical or circular, is not exactly. And all of these little inaccuracies, like these corners, you see that those three lines don't ever connect at the single point. That's a big problem for any kind of processing algorithms. So, I mean, in terms of like geometry representations, maybe it's kind of something in between point clouds and kind of polygon soups. It's weird, it's complicated. And also, humans are particularly terrible at depicting projections or perspective, right? Any kind of projections. So this was a projection, this was a drawing made by semi-professional artists, as far as I remember, from this render. You can see that it's kind of distorted in some way, yeah? So we're not good at capturing this. And in general, there was a fun study, quite a few studies done in this area to figure out how well we actually understand perspective. So people were given these cylinders on top without the central piece, and were just asked, can you draw the circle in the center, right? And they were supposed to be drawing this black line in the middle, so this thing exactly, in different views. And the red lines are exactly what they drawn. So if you turn it from the side, you should see, if they drew it correctly, you should be seeing this vertical line. Yeah? Instead, you see all of that stuff, right? And you see that the more perspective there is, the worse people are. Right? So there is a clear bias and so forth. So it's a known phenomenon. People don't understand perspective well. And even if they did, they're sometimes not even trying. Sometimes they're trying to do something like, for what you expect in a photograph, you would expect some kind of orthographic projection or perspective projection, something of that sort. That's on the left. And on the right, that's what you get from an artist, right? This is called multi-perspective, when you have a couple of vanishing points or maybe a couple of centers of projection. So it's complicated, right? Sometimes it's described by nonlinear perspective. Anyway, a bunch of models. Point is, people don't draw perspective projection or orthographic projection. So if your algorithm assumes something of that sort to reconstruct 3D, you'll be in trouble, essentially. Kind of a fun question is, why is it okay for us as humans? Like, it's somehow strange that we interpret line drawings pretty well, even though they're weird, they're distorted. Yeah? And there's a theory, this is a kind of some medieval, whatever, painting kind of illustrating that if you look locally, all components make sense. If you look globally, this cannot exist, in Escher style kind of stuff. Anyway, so the current theory by Hertzman is that maybe humans actually don't imagine a 3D object or a 3D scene consistently as they're exploring the world. Maybe it's kind of piecewise. You explore, you understand a little piece of the world, and then you don't actually connect the puzzle pieces. So point is, a little checkpoint, is that sketches are really not photos. Yeah, they're weird, simplified, distorted things. And if you think about you're, for example, creating a model that does sketch-based retrieval, so you want to find a 3D shape corresponding to your image, to your sketch. Imagine this is the sketch of a snail that the person gave. Yeah, this is an actual painting from 14th century. It will be difficult to compare this sketch with a 3D shape using standard metrics like chamfer or Hausdorff or L2. It'll be very far off, right? So you need to have something either data-driven or perception-driven. right? So this is kind of the idea. This is the weird world we're living in. All right, so let's think of what's inside actually sketches before even starting thinking about the global problems we're facing. So as Chenxi mentioned, usually there are kind of two worlds in sketches, or in drawings. It's the same thing for us within this context. So usually they're raster world, made out of images made out of pixels, and vector world, when images are made out of curves or strokes, right? So usually people, artists in general, or even non-professionals, draw in raster software, or even on a piece of paper and then scan. And the reason for it is because it's just richer. Like you can do shading, like they just shaded some fill, some region, or strokes with the same tool. It's kind of nice. And also you see texture, it's richer, it's nice. But if you want to do any sort of meaningful processing, if you want to do shape analysis or anything of that sort, you need to convert it into actual geometry, not just pixels, right? So the process of vectorizations, so finding these curves, seems to be something crucial. And turns out it's a pretty hard task. So in this world of sketches, there's a whole variety. You can start with clean sketches like this, and maybe we'll be mostly talking about that. But then there's a whole, overdrawn sketches, or filled sketches, or even like colored stuff. And each one requires kind of a slightly different approach. So if we think about the main components, what's inside a sketch, maybe the main object is a stroke. Yeah, so if you think of, for example, this is a stroke. Yeah, so if you're vectorizing or if you're processing, you probably would want to figure out that that's a single piece. Some strokes connect at junctions, like this. This is called a T-junction, right? It forms a little T. Some strokes merge into a single line, like maybe here. These kind of merge, or you can imagine that they're merging. That's called a Y-junction. Right? And strokes have endpoints. So these are the most important topological and geometrical objects that we're working with. At the same time, junctions are a little more complicated than they seem. So even for a clean drawing like this, if you zoom in a little bit, you can see that in a bunch of places, those were supposed to be junctions, but the artist actually didn't draw them this way. So they're kind of implied junctions. Depending on the scale, depending on the kind of surrounding and the context, some people would say that they should be junctions. Some people would say they should be disconnected, right? So it's a perceptual question again. Or in this, for example, it's supposed to be an intersection, but it's not actually drawn, right? So it's hard to tell. So if we think more about what's happening in the sketch in general, we know a little bit. There's been quite a few perceptual works in this area. We know some of the lines that people draw. Yeah? So in this experiment, the researchers showed this little rendering to artists and asked them to draw this using just lines, using curves, right? And then they essentially kind of registered all these drawings and merged together, and that's what you have on the right. And then the researchers tried to guess, like, what are these lines people draw? Can you have some mathematical, maybe, model for them from the 3D object to render maybe something similar? Yeah? That would be the idea. And one of the kind of the common ideas in this domain is something called occluding contours, right? So those are points on a smooth shape with normals that are perpendicular to your view direction, right? So for example, for these green points, the normal is always kind of in this plane, and it's perpendicular to your view direction. So it turns out people consistently draw them, that's for sure. Yeah? Also, what's interesting is that there are two parts of these contours. There's the visible part that people actually draw and invisible part. Invisible part people don't draw, but it's actually important if you want to reconstruct the object. So this is kind of interesting. If you look at, this is by the way, the typical, if you just render a 3D object with just occluding contours, it would look something like this. Not quite like a drawing, but something in that direction. And if you compute the percentages, maybe roughly more than half of all the drawn curves are actually occluding contours. So a lot of curves. If you think about some other mathematical objects that simulate what people draw, turns out that we can explain a lot of curves by looking at something called ridges and valleys, right? Those are local maximum of principal curvature. So for example, the tip of the nose here, it's it's a sort of a sharp feature. So the kind of, if you look at the extreme of the principal curvature, it would be some line like this, right? So we can draw lines like this. This is called a ridge, and the opposite, where it's the minimum, we call the valley. At the same time, so they can explain a lot of the curves that people draw, but at the same time, if you just draw all of them, it doesn't look anything like a drawing, right? It looks very kind of synthetic. There's an extension of that that explains a little more. So this is called apparent ridges and valleys, essentially when you project the curvature and then find maximum. And maybe we can also guess some additional curves like this. So for some particular sketches, like in industrial design, people draw lines of curvature, essentially just directions of principal curvature, like these crosses. Those are called cross sections, right? That's how people show the kind of the convexity, whatever, the local shape. So kind of the natural question is, okay, fine. We know some of the models that people use, or maybe we can explain we can explain the curves. So maybe we can just render that, and it will be something close to actual sketches. We can learn from that, and it's all great. And well, it turns out it's not a great idea. So synthetic sketches look something like this. So those are occluding contours plus apparent ridges plus ridges and valleys. But you can see that they're pretty far from actual sketches. It's there are some additional distortions, some shading. It's more complicated. And it turns out, so far, we can only explain roughly 60% of what people draw with these models. The rest we actually don't know, or we don't have a good model of. Sure, it's something about shading, but like, how can you actually model what they do? So kind of a little checkpoint is that sketches have different stroke types. Each one has a very different meaning. So if you're trying to extract some 3D information from it, or some even additional 2D information from it, you gotta kind of understand, have a little interpretation of what's going on. What's important is these strokes connect at junctions and intersections. So that's kind of important artifact we're going to be talking about. And figuring out who's who is actually quite a big challenge. All right, now a little more into processing. So let's think about the 2D and 3D shape sketches actually represent. So we're moving closer to the world of applications. So as far as geometric representation goes, sketches are pretty bizarre in the sense that the typical sketch, if you think about the 2D shape it represents, so just a bunch of these, like union of these strokes, they represent a non-manifold 1D structure, right? So like here, locally, everything here is one-dimensional, so it looks like a one manifold. But if you look at the junction or any intersection, it's locally non-manifold, right? So you cannot map it onto R. Well, at least. Yeah? And another interpretation of it is if you have some thickness. For example, here you can think of this sketch illustrating or depicting this 2D shape. Yeah? So it's kind of a region in 2D. So in this case, it's two manifold. So you have two views. So either one manifold or two manifold. One of the typical components of a sketch is something called a cluster. So a bunch of these strokes parallel to each other. And you can interpret them in both kind of 1D fashion and in 2D fashion. So you can think of these strokes are used just to depict the same shape, but kind of more carefully every time with more precision. And in this case, the natural way is just to simplify them or kind of find the center line. Or in the other way, you can think of them as depicting width. Like here, probably these clusters, bunch of parallel strokes, they depict some width, wide strokes. So on top of kind of, if you think about the 2D shape, you can think of also how the strokes connect. And as I said, lots of junctions are actually not drawn precisely, not in 2D, not in 3D. It's always either there's a little overhanging or little gaps. And so in this case, for example, this is formally those are three separate strokes, but like this is probably an implied T junction. This is probably an implied Y junction, right? So if you think about any 3D reconstruction method, it's actually kind of important to deal with. And this, for example, on the right is an implied continuation. So somehow the artist broke the stroke into two. And how to formulate that, how to even understand that? Well, formally in psychology, this is explained with something called Gestalt continuation. So essentially when strokes kind of look at each other or can be easily connected, our brain interprets it as a single curve or as a good continuation. And there were some experiments a little later to try to quantify what's the deal. So here, for example, you can probably see the contour starting from here until there. Yeah. So the experiment was that if the kind of these little pieces of strokes have less than 18 degrees between them, then you can kind of our brain sees a solid contour. So using that directly, though, in algorithms to actually have a single curve or reconstruct a single curve is pretty complicated because it depends on the context. Another kind of interesting question is that if you think about just the 2D object drawn, your natural question is what's kind of in the shape, what's a hole in the shape. Yeah? So you can think that these strokes are pretty close, but for example here, there are little holes between them, but we don't think of it as a hole in an object. They're too close. Yeah? Here, there's a clear white space, so that's probably a hole. So guessing that, kind of finding the robust algorithm that gives you the shape, it's kind of important. And finally, if you think about the 3D shape the object represents, the sketch represents, here you understand for example, the hind leg here, the pink or magenta hind leg is in front of the body because of these junctions, right? So because of these junctions, you probably, maybe some anatomy involved also, but mostly of the junctions, and you probably understand the local Z order, local depth order. So dealing with them would give you some sort of a 3D reconstruction. And in the white space, if you think of like, okay, what's going on? So we understand something about the strokes. What's going on here in the white space? A typical assumption is that whenever you don't draw something, it's something smooth. Yeah? So this method in particular, for example, reconstructs the 3D object, assuming that this is smooth. Right? And it kind of is a decent reconstruction for that purpose. At the same time, if you ask like in this particular case, this drawing was done from an object like this. You see there's a bit of sharp ridge here. Yeah? So it's not exactly smooth, and assuming that the object is smooth in white space is a bit of a lie. Moreover, if you think of kind of more complex objects like this, you see that this is a real sketch drawn from this viewpoint. You can see that the artist actually didn't draw all the little details, yeah? And left a lot of white space. So white space means the artist decided to abstract out the object. Yeah, so those are not essential details for the shape. All right, so now having said all of that, we know something about the 2D and the 3D about sketches. There are a bunch of kind of core problems in this domain and some attempts at solutions, some decent solutions as well. And kind of this is the core of many, many algorithms. So if we can solve these things well, we can solve pretty much the whole, all the problems in this domain. So I'm going to mention a few things. I'm going to go over some things very quickly because for the sake of time. So probably the first question, the first core challenge in this area is figuring out the topology. By topology, I mean who's connected to whom. This is important, for example, for a simple algorithm like flood fill of this sketch. Yeah? So depending on how you define whether these are actually connected or disconnected, these strokes, there are little gaps between them, I'm going to show them. The flood fill is going to either leave a white space there or white space there or color it correctly. Yeah? So essentially, you need to figure out whether this is a real connection or whether it's a real gap. Yeah? So kind of bug versus feature. And this question of bug versus feature, whether it was intended to be separate or not, is context dependent. So what I mean by context dependent is that, like here, you would probably say that this is maybe a junction, or maybe it's separate. It's hard to tell. It's ambiguous. Here, it's hard to tell whether there was a separate or not. And if you think how important that is to applications, it's actually a big deal. If you think of vectorizing this thing, for example, would you like the software to connect this into a single curve or not? Yeah. Would you like to control them together or not? Yeah. So it's important for the final application. And at the same time, there's a little tiniest gap here, which probably is a good idea to connect, yeah? So it depends on something, maybe some scale, but it's hard to put your finger on what exactly. You can think that maybe there's a simple threshold. So another kind of topological question is whether strokes are kind of, they form clusters or not. So in this case, you can think of these extreme stroke, a stroke here and a stroke here on the other side of the cluster. They're pretty far by absolute magnitude. But they're clearly together here. At the same time here, for example, the strokes probably have the same distance between them, but they're clearly separate, right? So like single distance won't cut it, right? There's something about maybe some density of strokes, something else going on, so that we interpret these as together, and those are those as separate ones. And what's important is that it kind of varies over the single drawing. So it's not like different artists have different precisions, which is true also, but it's more complicated than that. So this is, by the way, one of the classical problems in this domain is how to segment a drawing into clusters, right? So that's a kind of topological / geometrical problem. And the problem here is that it depends on perception. It's not just kind of pure accuracy, noise level stuff. And the current state-of-the-art solutions in this domain particular for kind of topological questions is actually classical machine learning, not deep machine learning. Yeah? It's very hard to come up with reliable data sets or large data sets in this area. So what people do is that they handcraft features. For example, here, if you want to see whether two segments are connected, two strokes are connected or not, they have some features like distance or tangents or whatever, something context dependent. And then they train some classical machine learning tools like random forest, a bunch of classifiers that will give you an answer when you kind of aggregate them. So this is the state of the art right now. Another kind of interesting idea in this area that also can be used for topological questions is something called ReebGraph. And so it's a kind of a tool that comes from kind of general topology. And the idea is that you can study a topology of a 3D shape, or essentially whatever, how it works inside, by studying how functions work on this shape. Yeah? For example, here we have our favorite donut. We can look at how function of a height, so just height that from the bottom to the top, how this function changes over the shape. And what ReebGraph does, essentially, you draw lots of isolines, so all these little kind of horizontal curves that are isolines of height. Yeah? And for every isoline, you try to contract it into a single point. Yeah? So you start from here. Your isoline is little kind of point on the donut. You contract it to a single point. All good. You continue on going up. Your curve expands. You keep contracting it to a single point. That's pretty easy. And somewhere along here, so at a point that is called the saddle, you now have two curves, right? Because the height here and height here is the same, right? So you have two curves. You can no longer contract it to a single point. You have 2 points, right? So you form a graph like this that starts going just like a single piece, then it forks into two little pieces, and then it merges at this point. Yeah? And then it continues as a single piece. So this is the ReebGraph of a shape. And you can apply it to study topology of lots of shapes, but in particular, it's used in quite a few vectorization algorithms. When you have a cluster of shapes, a cluster of strokes, you can think of contracting this little isoline into a single vertex of a graph. Right? So this forms the ReebGraph of a stroke, or ReebGraph of vectorization in general. So this is one idea. All right, so much for topology. Another kind of fundamental problem is figuring out who's foreground, who's background. And in computer vision, this is a very classical problem, figuring out whether it's a person or a wall, right? And for sketches, it becomes a little more complicated because it's actually somewhat ambiguous. First of all, it's not color-based or not texture-based, because you can see that inside of this character is also white, just like the paper. And also there's a shadow. What do we do with the shadow? Is that foreground or background, right? So, but at the same time, this probably has to be solved by just pure deep learning approaches. It's clearly in that area. For vector sketches, you can formulate the problem slightly differently. You can say which part of the 2D shape is shaded, which part is not shaded. So here, for example, it's clearly shaded, so it's kind of a foreground. Yeah? So you can probably, you want to extract a shape like this. And why is this important? Well, imagine you want to deform this vector drawing, right? So you use your favorite mesh deformation tool or point cloud deformation tool, and they're all based on some notion of interior, right? You need to define your favorite Laplacian operator, you need interior, yeah? You need some shape, yeah? So you kind of need some shape like this to deform or to animate or to do anything, any processing actually, or lots of processing with it. So a tool for that domain is something called check complex, also from topology. It's a fancy name for something that is very simple. You have a point cloud. Let's say you have just these points in 2D, and you want to figure out who's connected to who. Like, where is the shape? You see that some points are close together, some points are far together. Probably the ones that are close together are somehow connected. This is the idea. So, and all this check complex does is that for a fixed radius epsilon, it just draws balls of radius epsilon around every point. Every time two circles intersect, you connect them. Yeah? So for example, these two points are close together, so you connect them by an edge, right? And every time three circles intersect, you connect them by a triangle, right? So every time there's multiple intersections of balls, you just create a simplex of that size, right? So this is a very kind of simple tool in topology. And it turns out you can apply this for figuring out exactly this interior versus exterior for vector sketches. Essentially, all you do is that you have samples on your strokes, and you build a check complex, which in this case is called sketch complex. And you add some of these connections. You form this little subgraph if the vertices are too close. You use the connectivity of the strokes to not add all the connections, because that would not work. And then essentially these connections form boundaries of these little domains. You just have to figure out who's inside, who's outside out of these little domains. So this is the kind of the recent paper. Yeah, so for example here you can see that even though these strokes are disconnected, this little connection was added just by a kind of sketch complex, check complex thing, which is a kind of prescriptive simple algorithm but very robust. So that's the utility. All right, a few more. So in kind of the vectorization domain, or in any processing, maybe 3D reconstruction domain, it's important to understand junctions. So first of all, they give you an idea of a depth. And second of all, for vectorization, you kind of have to find where the stroke ends, where it starts. So junctions and endpoints are a big deal. And the current state of the art is just a fully convolutional network that essentially gives you heat maps of where strokes are, where endpoints are. It's used by a couple of vectorization papers. And the only trouble with that is, it seems to be a very natural solution, and it's a little bit hard to train because, as I said, it's hard to collect data for this domain. So it's kind of a mix of synthetic and real data. It works sometimes. But the tricky bit is that if you base the whole vectorization system on this detector, every time it fails, you have to manage it somehow, and it's difficult. Yeah. So even with accuracy of like 90-something%, it fails in roughly 10% of the cases, which is quite a lot for drawings. And in general, if you think of like collecting real data set of where people see junctions, well, try asking people about this particular drawing, right? You can either, depending on the level of abstraction you imagine in your head, you can either mark every little endpoint here or every little intersection, or you can think of like, this point is probably just a single junction point. It's a little hard to test, hard to tell. All right. And then connected to these junctions are just something about occlusion. So anything related to 3D or even deformation of 2D drawings or animation of 2D drawings, you would have to deal with occlusions. And one part of the trouble with occlusions is figuring out where are the hidden contours, where are the occlusion contours that are invisible. So for example here, these gray curves are the hidden contours. And in a pretty recent paper, it was just still drawn manually. So you would ask the artist to actually annotate. Yeah? For this drawing, this annotation is actually not that hard. As an artist, you've still spent time, drawing this elephant. You might as well add a bit. But it turns out for general smooth objects, drawing these hidden contours is hard. Yeah, so for this 3D object, for example, the hidden contours look like this. This is nothing intuitive at all. It takes quite a bit of processing to even understand why this is the case. Something called cusps, anyway. They essentially form a smooth curve on the shape, and it bends like this when it projects. Asking people to draw this is a nightmare. Nobody's going to draw this, right? So it's very hard to collect a reliable data set of this. And because of the domain gap, it just doesn't generalize well from synthetic drawings. So it's a bit of a trouble. And here, for example, another part of occlusions is just figuring out that, for example, here, the left leg of this person is occluding the right leg. So just understanding that this part is behind the other one, kind of the local order based on occlusions, is super complicated, and we still don't know how to do this well. And why do we need this? Well, imagine you're trying to animate a drawing. Yeah, if you have a drawing without occlusions, you can just use your favorite skinning method. This is, for example, the bounded by harmonic skinning. Works perfectly well for 2D drawings without occlusions, but for drawings with occlusions, you have to resolve it first, right? Otherwise, it's not going to deform correctly. So this is the big deal. A surprising question is just figuring out the tangents of strokes. It turns out even that is complicated in that domain, right? So if you think of a raster drawing, here are a bunch of pixels, yeah? And you're trying to figure out where is the stroke going, just the local tangent. You can probably say that those are the local tangents, and the typical way to do this is to find the gradient of an image and just rotate it by 90 degrees. The gradient is going to point towards the black pixels, and so it's kind of a normal, and then you rotate it by 90 degrees, you get a tangent. That sometimes works, but if you imagine now you have a bit of color variation within the stroke, a bit of like gray, black stuff, your gradient is going to be noisy, right? And if you imagine what's going on close to endpoints, it's going to be bad. And what's worse is that even the tangents are perceptual. They're not well defined. For example, here, you can either draw the tangents that are exactly precise based off of the drawing, something like this. So if you compute it, there'll be something like this. But maybe perceptual correct tangents should be something like this. Yeah? Maybe the person was just a little sloppy when drawing this. Yeah, so maybe that is actually correct. And for vector drawings, so those are raster, for vector drawings, things are not easier. If you look into this, there's a little hook at the end of a vector stroke. And so even that tangent computation is going to be off. And it's a big deal for any sort of segmentation of strokes and simplification, beautification of them, and so forth. And here, even like far from endpoints, in the middle of a cluster, people just draw like this. Yeah, so it's very complicated, actually. One solution to that is instead of the gradient, which looks like this, and you see that around junctions, for example, it's noisy, it's not good, so it kind of turns a little too smoothly. What we can do is use something called frame fields. So essentially, per pixel, you find a single cross instead of a single direction. And that allows you, for these kind of junctions at least, to have something super stable, right? So with that, you can see very clearly the two directions. So now to find tangents, you just have to guess which of those two directions. That discrete choice seems easier in lots of cases. This, however, fails for high valence junctions, right? So if you have multiple curves intersecting at a single point, you may either predict lots of little directions, but that's also tricky because of something called singularities that I'm not going to go into. So anyway, that's complicated right there. Another kind of classical problem is something called parametrization. So you're all familiar with mesh parametrization, probably. In this case, parametrization means that if you have a cluster of strokes, your task is to figure out its arc length parametrization. So just kind of go along the cluster with 1 meter per second. Yeah, so in this case, the correct parametrization is like this. From blue to red, it's travel around the stroke. And why it's complicated is because you don't know per se that this point is not adjacent to this point. Yeah? So kind of understanding which point is adjacent to which is actually kind of tricky. And this has a decent solution by now. It's based on iconal equations that Zoe talked about. Essentially, you discretize an iconal equation for this stroke on the samples of the stroke. It's a little tricky, but it's just a matter of discretization. And it gives you exactly this function, which is pretty robust. All right. Maybe one of them kind of still in a 2D static domain, one of the most complicated problems is finding just center lines. Yeah, so this is a core problem in vectorization or in deformation. So for a raster image like this, you just want to find, you don't even care about topology, you just want to find points in the middle of the stroke, something like this. And so these points like this. One of the, it's an old paper, but it was still kind of working pretty well until recently. So for what they do is that they find a gradient of an image, arrows pointing towards black stuff, and they just throw a bunch of particles which flow along this gradient. Yeah, and once the particles start hitting each other, then they stop. Yeah, or essentially you do gradient descent on this, right? And you get a bunch of points like this. They're close to centers, and this works pretty well for clean digital drawings when your gradient is reliable. But for anything but like your pencil sketch scans, it's not going to work, right? There's a recent paper that predicts essentially an unsigned distance field, so distance to the center line. I don't know, it's a little hard to see, but essentially the blacker, the closer to center line it is. It's trained on synthetic data mostly, so we'll see how well that works, but it's a good idea in general. And a related problem to center lines and strokes in general is, for example, figuring out whether it's a stroke or a fill, right? Like here, for example, there's a stroke, and this part is a fill. And because of this distinction, nobody can vectorize this well right now. So it's an open problem. All right, I'm going to quickly finish off with this kind of major problem. So in the world of animation, one of the typical problems is that you have one drawing, one keyframe, another keyframe, and you want to find how to interpolate between them. It's called in-betweening. And vector drawings are actually kind of give a bit of hope there. Because we can, for example, if you have correspondence that this stroke corresponds to this stroke, maybe finding point-wise correspondence is now easier, right? So if you have stroke-wise correspondence, point-wise maybe is easier. But this stroke-wise correspondence is a large pain because, for example, here, this point goes to this point. Okay, fine, we can do something about it. This point on the belt, maybe you can match to this point on the belt. But some of the points, they kind of split into two because of the occlusions. For example, this point here should be mapped to these two different points. So it's kind of one-to-many correspondence. And some points just disappeared. Like there was this point here on this keyframe, and it went nowhere, right? And it's something related to inconsistency of how people draw and also to occlusions. So it's a hard problem. There's no good solution so far. The current solutions are it's a recent paper that works for clean drawings that essentially saying that if you have a single vector drawing on a single keyframe, maybe you can try retracing it over the second one. And they do essentially this retracing using a transformer. You can think of typical matching tools in your toolbox. Maybe you heard of optical flow in computer vision. What they do is essentially it's a vector field that deforms one drawing into the other. That doesn't seem to work well once you have occlusions because that's the matching with occlusions is no longer smooth. And another idea also in this domain is that you just try optimizing the shape of your strokes from the single drawing to match the second one, and you use some differential renderer inside. That also has problems with local minima. So you're also, because of the occlusions, you're also often stuck. Another approach is to use functional maps. So essentially, once you have the domain once you know what's interior, what's exterior, you can find a functional map, which is, if you haven't heard of this one, it's essentially the color here represents which point goes where. So the similar colors are, corresponding points. Turns out it looks good on the slide, but it's not good in practice. for sketches, that is, because like if you zoom in into this pointwise correspondences, they're all over the place, slightly within some radius. So they give some idea, but not an ultimate solution. So the kind of the ultimate checkpoint before I ask Chenxi to continue is to say that even the most basic things, like figuring out the tangents, are complicated for sketches, but at the same time, they're super interesting as representations. So maybe having principal solutions to any of those challenges can be a big deal. Anyway, so now I turn over to Chenxi.
So yeah, thank you for covering the fundamentals. I'm back to introduce state-of-the-art research and their applications. So we have seen this diagram before. On the very low level, we have the tracking samples, the raster pixels. In the middle, we have the 2D and 3D sketches. And on the high level, we have models and animations, also some vision tasks, okay? So I'll try to cover as broad as possible and hope you can find some aspects of sketch-related research interesting. We have a more complete list of related papers on this GitHub page. So for the low level, we'll see how 2D and 3D strokes are constructed and some common drawing interfaces. As a reminder, the very basic procedure of a drawing interface is to turn a sample sequence into a digital stroke. We can trivially connect the dots into polylines, but this is not a very good representation. It's jaggy, and we need to store all the points. We can construct splines instead, like this two. Here are two sub-questions. So one is which connectivities we pick, and the other one is where to put them. For different locations, we approximate the input samples with different accuracies. This is pretty much a solved problem for 2D. For 3D, similarly, we want to know how to convert 3D samples to, for example, ribbons. Artists may intend to use different types of ribbons for different parts. For example, for this elephant, the artist may want to use curved ribbon for the ear and for the nose, but then the bent ribbon for the tasks. So this method here, adaptive brush, is a system that solves for ruling direction in real time. The existing solutions pose some ergonomic challenges to the artist. You can see those gestures are not very comfortable, but this work is able to avoid those problems. So built upon these very basic procedures, we have modern drawing software with some features. So we have the classic drawing software, for example, Photoshop, Clip Studio Paint, Krita. Krita is a free and open source software, and all of them work in the raster space. They share some common features. They support layering, backfill regions, etc. For cartoon production, we have common software such as Toon Boom Harmony, TV Paint, and Adobe Animate. They work in a raster and vector hybrid space because, as mentioned, it's easier to animate vector graphics using auto in-betweening. We also have some more recent trendy software such as Procreate and Fresco. They are for the touchable device, such as your iPad. As far as I know, Fresco is the only mainstream drawing software that supports vector sketching and drawing. This is not fully related, but Rebel is a painting simulator. I'm mentioning this one because this is the one used to create stylized animation in the recent Spider-Man animation movies, which may be interesting to some of you. Many research questions I'm going to cover can be mapped to practical features in this software. So here we have some popular 3D drawing softwares. We have a Gravity Sketch. That's also the one used in this demo video. We have Shapes XR, and we also have Tilt Brush from Google. 3D sketching software is less mature compared to the 2D one. And that's, we have more open questions to solve. For example, layers are pretty common for 2D painting scenario, but they are not supported in any of the software we saw in the previous slide. And this is a new SIGGRAPH paper, and they propose to have the layering mechanism, but for 3D. So apart from transferring 2D software features to 3D, 3D sketching also faces many fundamental issues. First, it's really hard to draw midair. So we can see here, it's very hard to draw an accurate curve. And it's even worse if we see from the side view. They are not really accurately on the not on the plane. And this is because it's really hard to perceive depth, and it's also really hard to do depth correctly in this scenario. And of course, there are the ergonomic problems we saw before. So one solution is to use something called a curve network. This is a pretty standard object for 3D modeling. Given a collection of vertices and curves connecting them in the 3D space, there are many methods and software for surfacing this curve network. So Chenxi is a system automatically snaps and fairs input in accurate 3D strokes, and it immediately surfaces the network so the user can see the depth better. So this is for the VR drawing scenario. We have some takeaways. We learned that 2D software is mature with a fixed set of features, but for 3D, we don't have really developed hardware interface or even artist practice. They are still developing. For sketching and drawing interface research, the real-time response is a hard requirement, so the method needs to run relatively fast. And for the historic 2D sketch processing algorithm, such as the spline method I introduced, is pretty reliable and the code is online, so you may want to put that into your toolbox. We can also get point samples that is the pixels from raster images. They already look relatively good, but for further processing to use them for modeling or animation, we need to turn them into such as vector drawing to have some types of structures for them. Raster sketches can contain a lot of noise from either scanning or human sketching. As a pre-processing, we can turn raster rough sketches into raster clean line drawings. This group of work started with training a CNN with annotated rough clean sketch pairs. So we have the input rough sketch on the left and the output clean one on the right. So the authors then in a later work added GAN loss. So we can see over there. So they can train on unlabeled data. As Misha mentioned, it's really expensive to get professionally good data. So you kind of have to use unlabeled data in some sense. So this later paper along the line interactively incorporates user edits, which is from augmented training with synthetic data. So this system allows input inking in red and also erasing in green. We can see here. For the actual sketch vectorization, we extract stroke center lines from a raster sketch. The sketch can be rough or clean depending on the method. The first modern sketch vectorization paper works on clean inputs. So here are some zoom in onto the junctions, the connectivities. It extracts clean vector line drawings as undirected graphs. And this method focuses on junction connectivities. For this example, for these four-way junctions, we may have very different appearance based on the connectivities we have. To determine the connectivity types, this paper uses thresholds determined by a set of annotated sketches. The later work keeps the topological graph abstraction. That's roughly the same for this beginning part. And then this work also added a fidelity versus simplicity optimization to balance the fitting accuracy measured by this arrow here, and the stroke simplicity measured by the degree of Bezier curves they use. So this fidelity versus simplicity notation will show up multiple times in other sketch-related work. This paper works on overdraw inputs with a region-based extraction step. But in practice, we can see in this example, their implementation has some problems handling open curves like the mouth of this giraffe. We covered the frame fill in the previous part. These two papers use frame fields to guide vectorization, both for graph construction and curve tracing. This follow-up work added a network to predict key points, these different types we saw from the previous part as well. And then those key points are connected into a graph based on the underlying frame field. As mentioned before, the drawback is it's not as robust if I'm missing the key points. The newest vectorization method for this C-graph also treats inputs as being clean sketch. The big advantage is this method can handle complicated and pretty complicated and large sketches in reasonable time. So this is pretty much the first method that can actually work on these types of inputs. The key idea is to predict the unsigned distance field, as mentioned, and extracts topology via neural dual contouring. Overall, to achieve this performance, they have a bag of neural components, as we can see over there. And they are all connected together in a pretty complicated way. So you can read their paper or go to their talk later. This last paper takes a very different approach. They vectorize by tracing the input raster image. At each step, they use a CNN encoding and RNN decoding network. So the network outputs a curve starting from the center of the current window. We can see for S1 and S2, and then this network scales and moves the window for the next step. When the operation is panned up, such as for S3, it simply moves the window without tracing the curve. To avoid redundant overlapping strokes, this paper uses a fidelity versus simplicity style loss. But still, in practice, its outputs often contain a lot of redundant strokes. We can see all those colors on the right, making this paper not very practical for applications. One reason related topic in vector space is diffusion model-based sketch generation. Clipasso started a series of work about generating vector sketches and videos using first clip loss, as the name implies, and then later score distillation sampling. So different from this paper's sketch knitter is about training diffusion models specifically for vector doodles. Okay. So we have seen that image-to-image network is good for raster space operations, such as raster space cleanup, key point prediction, etc. But because for this problem, our target output is in vector format, we kind of have to have some discrete step, which can be graph-based or maybe based on neural dual contouring. Among all these methods, only few methods can handle overdrawing, and all the other methods can only work on clean sketches. And because data is pretty rare and also expensive, most learning-based methods are trained on synthetic data or a combination of annotated and unannotated data. The newest method we just saw uses a bag of components. Maybe in the future, hopefully we can see something simpler and more elegant for vectorization. So next, we'll cover processing 2D sketches. This is necessary because typical rough sketches contain overdrawing and also inaccurate junctions. Automatic cleanup, sometimes also called simplification or consolidation. So this method often starts by clustering the vector strokes. Each cluster is corresponding to one intended clean curve. An early method that follows this procedure is by Orbe and Kara. And this work identified many common sub-questions, such as whether two individual strokes should be together in a cluster or not. And they apply learning to answer this as a classification problem. Then the vector strokes are gradually chained into clusters based on piecewise scores. And they also identify the common artifact of branching. So for branching, I mean, so on top, we can see there are two branches in red, and they are not supposed to be like that. In this paper, they resolve the problem by introducing a separate splitting step. A later work, stroke aggregator, uses perceptual cues determined by user studies As mentioned by Misha, perceptual cues are pretty important for this type of task. And this work identified a cue of density, which means within the same stroke cluster, the density is roughly even and is going to be, and it is high compared to the spacing between two different clusters. However, user studies don't scale very well with small cues, and it's hard to estimate density when strokes are few within the cluster. In this follow-up work, we use learning to avoid the previous problems, and unlike Orbe and Kara, incrementally compare new stroke to existing clusters to avoid the common branching artifacts. Once strokes are clustered, we can replace each cluster with a fitting curve. Several papers treat this problem as standard 2D point fitting problem. Orbe and Kara on the top right, they used Laplacian eigenmaps for more complicated inputs, such as the self-intersecting clusters. However, all these methods fit by averaging input positions, ignoring the stroke connectivities. We can see in this two example, by also fitting the input tangents, we can get visually much better looking results. Stroke strip is a method just designed for fitting specifically strokes given the clustering. It first orients input directed strokes in a similar fashion as normal orientation for surface stroke construction. Then it iteratively parameterizes the strokes based on tangent alignment and ecnoterm, which was mentioned from the previous part. For my experience of using this method, it's relatively robust. You can build other things on this method. Also, the code is open source online. You can put it into your toolbox. The failure cases mostly come from stroke orientation, which is the first part. Maybe you can improve that part. And the second parameterization part is quite robust. Once we have a clean sketch, we want to flat colorize it, but the standard bucket fill doesn't always work out of the box. Many raster space methods finish this task by filling in the regions. A classic method is this so-called trapped ball method. It is used by many later papers, such as the fidelity versus simplicity vectorization paper. So this method segments the region by moving fixed diameter balls from some seed positions. Another classic method from the same period is called the lazy brush, which uses the classic multi-way graph cut segmentation. And the interaction is the artist can put down some color scribbles and the method would automatically figure out what's the correct region to fill in. So this is the method used in many commercial software, such as the TV Paint, Krita mentioned before. More modern methods in the raster space basically use end-to-end neural models. This early raster to raster model fills in the gaps along the raster lines. So based on this large data set, this later method takes user scribbles for smart region filling in a similar interaction style as the lazy brush. The data set on the left has pretty reasonable size. So if you're interested in the question, you can look into that. There are also papers inspecting the same problem, but on vector sketches. Since we now have the stroke connectivities, we can construct potential junctions and inspect those junctions. Methods go from simply extending the endpoints, like in this early paper, to clustering endpoints using some heuristics, to later on some learning-based classification for the discrete junctions. A more recent work on this topic takes a hybrid approach. So they take in raster inputs. It combines neural field with classic trap ball to generate an initial segmentation. We see kind of middle to the right. And then this method also suggests neural lines, as labeled over there, to interactively fill in the gap along the lines. So an interesting aspect of this paper is they base many design decisions on interviews with professional webtoon artists. To summarize, on the very top level, as Misha also mentioned, we have the raster space versus vector space question. from my own observations, the majority of commercial tools are raster-based, which makes it easier for raster method to get directly tech transferred into those commercial software. And I would recommend you to read Benchmark for Rough Sketch Cleanup. It summarizes many existing challenges. For example, many sketch cleanup method ignore the thickness of the stroke, and they ignore the non-shaped strokes, which is the field mentioned before. And many of them are missing the global context. So for the flat colorization, even for professional artists, it's pretty hard to create topologically accurate junctions. The next topic is lifting 2D sketches to 3D. This is a challenging yield condition problem, and we are only going to cover the method for CAD-related applications today. Our recent return to this topic started with this dataset paper, the Open Sketch. So this paper contains professionally created industrial design sketches. They are in vector format. They have rich annotations we can see on the right, and they are all under CC0 lessons. So those are very good, high quality data. They also have their sketching and labeling interface called Open Source Online. So if you're interested in building your own sketching interface, maybe you can start from there. So using domain knowledge, this paper categorized lines into descriptive and construction lines. So one important type of construction line is called a scaffold. This is used for many applications and many modeling methods later, we'll see. Following this data set, here is a lifting method for industrial design sketches. And after lifting the sketches, we can generate a different viewpoint for the same input. By using the prior that construction lines actually aligned, this method reduces the degree of freedom for each stroke from two freely moving endpoints to moving the line in parallel in a space, which reduces a lot of computational complexity. There is a later follow-up work that uses extra global and local symmetry SQs to further improve the accuracy. Apart from lifted 2D sketches, we now also have sketches natively created in 3D. They can be from some types of VR drawing. This together motivates the problem of surfacing 3D sketches. Recall that we have three types of inputs for this method. We have point samples, we have ribbons, and we have tubes. For 3D points input, there's a lot of overlapping with surface reconstruction, but unlike regular surface reconstruction, the distribution of points is more uneven. So we can see here, we only have the samples along the stroke center lines, but not really in between them. This method, VIPS, is an implicit method that also orients the normals, but it has a drawback, which is the long runtime. It's very complicated in terms of the, it has a high computational complexity. And there is a more recent general surface reconstruction method that can also work on 3D sketching points. So this method uses binding number prior to orient the normals. When we are reconstructing from 3D ribbons, we have extra connectivity information. This will allow us to sew the surface by matching the points on the stroke center lines. So we can see the points on the center line on the left, and they are sewed together into a single piece of surface on the right. When the input is 3D tubes, these lines, those 3D lines can represent sharp features which VIPS cannot reconstruct. So this is the VIPS result. We can see it's pretty smooth everywhere on the surface. So this paper starts from VIPS mesh and iteratively segments and tightly feed the surface. So as a result, we have sharper features. For takeaways, we learned that sketch lifting is a yield condition problem that requires some priors. Using domain-specific priors, such as the ones for industrial design sketches, we can reduce the complexity of the solution. The surface reconstruction from 3D sketches shares many common characteristics as the standard surface reconstruction problem. but it also has its own special features and challenges. Because creation and editing 3D objects is very hard, people have been looking into Sketch as a better control for those types of tasks. We are going to talk about Sketch-based modeling, editing, posing, and animation. For modeling of organic shapes, the beginning is this very classic Teddy paper. This is a modeling interface. The user can change the camera angle and uses a fixed set of basic operations, such as the extrusion, and the system gives real-time feedback of the current model. So Teddy is then extended to fiber mesh with sharp features. This is still a modeling interface, which may not be as intuitive as drawing a single sketch and turning the sketch into a model. Ink and ray is a method for surfacing from a single drawing. It generates one-sided bas relief mesh for shading, but because we only have one side over here, the mesh cannot use for other purposes. Monster Mesh completes the other half of this bas relief meshes. Unlike Teddy, it supports a single point view modeling and also animation. So for methods targeting geometric and CAD models, there are some papers about surfacing curved networks. So from the beginning, people uses scaffold as cues, but later on that is relaxed. And along this line, they inspire later works for VR drawing, such as Chenxi. More recent work is neural network based, and these two papers focus on generating manufacturable CAD programs given ordered clean sketches. So as we can see on the bottom right, the result is basically CAD commands one can directly send to manufacturing machines. There are also more methods for domain-specific modeling using sketches. We can use sketches to model very tightly fit garment on the 3D characters. We can use them to build building models and also liquid characters, garment design patterns, and even complicated hairstyle for image synthesis. There hasn't been many methods about sketch-based mesh editing, since this topic has overlapping with modeling and posing. But here's an emerging direction, and this is for the diffusion-based 3D generation. The text prompt alone doesn't provide exact controls, which can be complemented by sketch editing. And here's a new paper, this incoming SIGGRAPH, that turns a sketch into a 3D model. And it also supports sketch-based editing, as we can see over here. Sketching, especially what's called line of action, is a common practice for traditional animation on paper. So here are 2 pages from traditional tutorial for animators. So we can see there are some lines kind of representing the gesture of the characters. Those are called the line of actions. So this practice directly inspired this early work that aligns spoons in yellow to the input line of action in red. The current sketch-based posing method can directly take raster drawing and pose a generic character in the middle. And this pose can be retargeted to other character rigs. Misha also covered this method in the previous part. To control the animation of a rig character, researchers start from simple path following and keyframe posing, as in this method. And then there are some later works about more articulated control for different parts of the character, such as the leg over here. And this is a newer work which offers even more articulated control. And as shown in this video, this is integrated into animation software. And the artist can change the interpolation along the line, along the guiding curve. So some takeaways are knowledge of sketch-based modeling can be adapted to new areas such as 3D sketching, and diffusion model-based 3D generation can be an interesting direction for sketch-based methods. So last, I'm going to briefly cover sketch-related vision tasks without going into too much detail. Researchers in the vision community also study sketches for very similar motivations. The differences lie on if the applications are standard vision tasks. For example, we have the standard segmentation. This is different from the cleanup because here we want to segment maybe a semantic part from this sketch, like the head of the bird. And sketches are also used for classic image retrieval. For a more detailed list, I recommend reading this recent survey, Deep Learning for Freehand Sketch, a survey. One cannot do modern vision research without data. Datasets from the graphics community, we can see over here, they often contain professional sketches, but because of the cost, there are not lots of training examples in them. The common datasets used by current vision research mostly contain doodles. Here are some examples. They are not they don't really have professional quality, but they come in large quantity. The common ones are the quick draw from Google and many datasets from SketchX Lab. As mentioned before, to get enough data, many methods apply synthesis. So here are two synthetic datasets, and there are also some recent non-photorealistic rendering method that may be applicable for this task. The middle one is quite interesting because it's specifically for design sketches. But as Misha mentioned before, they only cover roughly 60% of human-created lines. How to combine this synthetic data, these real sketches, is an interesting question. One important aspect of understanding sketches is the correspondence between sketches. So for example, the correspondence between different sketches of the same object, as the examples on the left, or they can even be of different objects in the same category. And as mentioned before, they are useful for graphics applications such as lifting and in-betweening. Another example of sketch understanding for vision tasks is the abstraction power. This current vision paper is about comparing the abstraction power of auto sketch generation method, such as Clip-Puzzle, to the human abstraction power. So here are some takeaways. The majority of current sketch-based vision research concentrates on abstract doodle-like sketches. This is partially because of the lack of complex and professionally created data, but the boundary between graphics and vision sketch-based research is being blurred as more methods become learning-based. It is interesting to see more data synthesis and pre-trained image models guiding the direction of the future research. Okay, I'm passing it back to Misha. Thank you.
I have just a single slide. So all I wanted to say is that this whole domain is, for me, sort of a wild west of research, in the sense that there are lots of problems we don't know how to solve. Essentially, there are lots of little topological and geometrical problems lurking in there. So whatever your ideas you have, you might just bring to this area. In this area, not everything is yet deep learning, which is hopeful for some of us. Anyway, so upon that, I wanted to finish, and thank you for your attention. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Or yeah. Any questions?
Going back to the perception stuff, super interesting presentation, by the way. What is it about the human visual system that makes it possible for us to perceive these sketches as real geometry that would exist even without textures, even though they're abstract?
Yeah, this is a very cool question. So nobody knows, if you want a short answer. A longer answer is that there were some fMRI studies, and the human brain essentially looks like the areas that light up in our brain for the photos and for line drawings are the same. So the current theory is that, which is, it's sort of pseudoscience, you can't actually prove it, but looks like our brain interprets line drawings as a very weird photographs under strange lighting with strange materials. So that's the current hypothesis. But yeah, we don't know, but they're super effective as depictions. That's the strange part. Good question.
Happy to ask something.
That's
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe just following on from that, like I saw that Teddy video. I wasn't aware of that old work. It was pretty cool. I don't know. It almost seemed like kind of an inverse of the lifting in a way. It was like you're taking some 3D representation and then giving sort of the 2D sketch that corresponds to it in various scenarios. Are there well, I guess it's two questions. How is that one working? What's the underlying 3D representation? Are there other works that are trying to do that, I guess, taking a 3D sketch and then coming up with sort of the 2D drawings from different perspectives or
Sorry, just to understand, you mentioned Teddy, but Teddy is 2D.
Right, I guess, but there was clearly, I guess, those sorry, I'm forgetting it now, the occluding contours, or rather, wherever the normal of the surface is perpendicular to the view directions, those obviously change as you rotate an object. So, I don't know, maybe it's something basic that people have developed for a while, but I thought it was cool that you could rotate the model and that would update.
Yeah, no, it's a kind of so there's a whole cottage industry of sketch-based interfaces when you have you rotate the model and you kind of add more contours as you go. So Teddy was one of them, and essentially you specify one occlusion contour, and that kind of gives you the boundary of your shape. You lift it, you kind of inflate it, then you rotate, then you correct it, and stuff like that. But there's a kind of a weird discussion to have there, because it's an interface. That means that you're not actually thinking in terms of the free sketch that you would draw. You're more getting used to the interface. So it might constrain the way you create shapes. So it's might be good, might be bad. It's hard to tell. Yeah. But there are a bunch of systems like this, yeah.
Hey, I thought it was really interesting you talking about some of the tools that are used for actual drawing, like Procreate, and highlighting some things we would normally take for granted. The fill tool doesn't work because there's a small hole in the line. I was wondering if there's any feature or something you came across in research that you think these industrial applications are missing or would make for a good update or something like that. So I guess it's more of an open-ended question.
In general, or for this particular gap filling thing?
I mean either. I guess in general.
Yeah. Just make sure. It sounds like any application that.
Yeah.
Okay. Essentially, all the for your question is for the gaps, the particular application, or any application of any kind of these little problems.
I think the latter.
Okay, they're essentially all the little kind of challenges that I was talking about. Even this thing is a kind of determining which part of the drawing is a stroke, which part is a fill. It's clearly a little geometrical problem that is kind of hard to determine, and it has all the applications. And for example, vectorizing this will require kind of having a region for a fill and having a stroke for a stroke, and this is an unsolved problem. So does that?
Yeah.
Okay. There was also a question there.
Thank you for your presentation. So, as a very novice user, so I think about drawing stick figures more skeleton style, because I am only that much talented. So, but I haven't. I don't even remember you mentioning that stuff. So, are they not expressive enough to be included in this research domain, or is there a reason
You're
you
thinking
didn't
for
talk
poses,
about?
right? For poses of characters, right? Stick
Yes,
figures.
stick figures like has more like the inner shape,
Yeah, no,
skeleton
it's
only.
actually a great tool. Also, it's also considered a sketch. It's fine. And actually, the sketch to pose system we mentioned at the end, Chenxi mentioned at the end, works for stick figures as well. It's fine. The only problem with stick figures is that you don't know what's in front of what. Like, there's no occlusion. But other than that, they're perfectly well. And yeah, it's supported, so you can get a 3D pose out of it.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you. I was thinking of the very first example you showed with the green figure, green humanoid figure that was adapted to the, and I was surprised if that's the state of the art, how bad it was doing.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if, like, is what it's missing, I mean, how does that work? They just like deform a 3D model adaptively until it matches the silhouette from a certain point of view?
Yeah, so like one of my students actually fixed this, so this is not state of the art anymore. So right now it works fine. But the computer vision thing, yeah. So for them, I mean, think how you would tell the depth angle, like how much it bends out of plane. That's usually based on something called foreshortening, like how your correct length, 3D length changes as you depict it, right? So it becomes shorter, that means it's rotated out of plane. Well, it turns out that this foreshortening is completely incorrectly drawn in most of the drawings. So the computer vision systems do that kind of stuff just because the proportions, the lengths are all over the place.
It
So
seems like what's missing is some kind of internal constraints on the 3D model, knowing about what the human body can and cannot do.
Well, that actually constraint exists there implicitly. I mean, it's trained on realistic human poses, so there is that prior. And I mean, this is a plausible pose, I guess. A human body can do that realistically. It's just awkward. It's not what is drawn, right? So that last paper that I'm mentioning, essentially, what we did there, we kind of undid these deformations. We kind of essentially match the distributions of what people draw versus what like realistic poses are. So you need to kind of undo this distortions people draw. So, but yeah, it's surprisingly bad actually. Yeah.
Maybe we'll just get a notice for 3 minutes over. Maybe people can come up and ask some questions.
Sounds great.
And we'll break for coffee break. The next talk is at 4. And thank you, speakers again.
Thank you.